when I was a kid, all I wanted to do was ride dirt bikes. That was my whole thing, man. And there's a type of dirt bike that's not quite a dirt bike and not quite a street bike. It's called an enduro, and the Honda XL. So my cab is essentially that. It's not focused entirely on being a heavy sound. It's not focused entirely on being a clean sound, but it works for both, and it really helps the front of house guy. Hey, I'm Dev. We're back again. And we're on tour with Dream Theater and Animals as leaders. And I'm about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks into the tour, which means I'm on the verge of acclimatizing myself to being on tour once again. Because whilst at home, it's amazing how much you take for granted things like having your own bed or toilet, or not being within a 1 to 2 inch proximity of 12 other males 24 hours a day on a steel tube careening down the freeway, which you can't use for number 2. So I'm almost there, and it's a pleasure to be back, and we're here to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is the fractal axe effects. One thing to point out before I explain my process is one of my favorite aspects of working with this unit is it's up to you how you want to do it. There's unlimited ways of navigating your workflow. So when I tell you how I do mine, it's not the way to do it. It's just the way that I've found to be most efficient. So live, I've got a single unit and then a redundancy, and Mike Keneally is also using a single unit, and the redundancy unit, which we haven't had to use thus far, is both of our patches. So all 3 units, my patches are on the A bank, Mike's patches are on the B bank. So if one of them goes down, we just use the backup, either A or B, depending on the player. Mike uses the FC12 because he's not singing as much as I. But for me, I run all my patch changes through MIDI. And as a result of that, I've got one main preset that I use for every song, but I name each song and then I copy that preset. So each time we go to a new song that has light cues, MIDI cues, drum patch cues, anything that is automated, it's like a dedicated preset. And you don't have to do it that way. I know that John Petrucci has one preset that he uses for the entire set and he just goes through it. But because I'm using Fractal direct to the board, There are no amps. I choose to have, Kingdom is one song, Grace is another song, Lightworker is another song. And then within that, if there are any iterations of that song that require things that aren't in the main preset, which is typically fairly comprehensive, then I'll just make it per song that change. Maybe one has a chorus, maybe one has a talk box or whatever. At home, I use the FC6 just because it's more compact. And then I run it into wedges, or Laney's got some cool cabs they've just put out, or the Firehawk is really a cool a full range solution as well. But for live, I don't actually use a pedal board because of the MIDI changes, but I do have a long TRS cable that connects the Fractal expression pedal. And one of my favorite things about the preset is the wah. If you're familiar with what I do, when I do the lead thing, I use the wah as like more of a vocal effect. So as opposed to going wah, 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 I'm just kind of keeping it cocked depending on which part of the neck that I'm in. And Matt at Fractal years ago gave me this cool little hack that I think is actually incorporated in the new firmware, where we run a volume pedal at the crossover point between the off on the wah, and essentially it gives you a much more transparent. So when it's back, it's off, but you don't hear the transition, right? And that really makes it a graceful vocal effect. Again, if you're doing Metallica or something where you're looking for a real definite wah 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 sound, I guess you could do that with this, but I use it I kind of just move it slowly while I'm playing, and depending on where I am on the fretboard, it's just. So it's just a real slight effect. And having that transition point so that the off-on of an auto-engage wah is seamless is one of my favorite things about the unit. And in fact, if you are using the FM9 or the FM3, I've made a patch for that, and that wah and that effect is included on that. So it's not voodoo juice, it's actually there, right? I remember when I was younger, there's always the purists that are like, well, the fact that you're using an effect that you enjoy means clearly that you're disqualified from being an actual player of the instrument. And it took me years of coming to terms with the fact that, fuck those guys, that I finally got to the point where however you write, the objective is to create and articulate the emotional components of your life through sound. And however you choose to do that, it shouldn't be a yes or no. And again, one of the many things that I love about the Fractal is essentially the way I use it. It's a blank slate. So when you purchase or you use a Fractal, a lot of the presets that you have will have, there's some amps, there's some effects, and it gives you sort of a starting point. But I think it's folly to assume that that's what the unit does, because my process is I start with a completely blank slate. And it just gives me essentially unlimited options as to how I want to route my sound. And I remember with my rack that I used to use and with all the amps that I used to use, just wiring it was so convoluted because I wanted the spillover, I wanted the auto-engage wah, I wanted the volume between the clean channel and the dirty channel to play ball with each other. And just on a physical level, wiring that up was very complicated. As soon as you put in a block, say you're putting together a virtual signal chain like I'm just describing, each one of the blocks gives you ideas in a sense. There's a number of starting points, but I encourage anybody who's using this type of technology to view it as just that. As opposed to saying, I'm trying to replicate something. Say, okay, so what about this particular model do I like? And what about it in the real world do I dislike? And then from there you could say, okay, so say in the virtual world, I like the Crybaby, which I do, but maybe the top point of the peak gets too shrill. So you pull that back. And I say, okay, the other thing I don't like is the very obvious off-on mechanism that has to happen when you're engaging it. So, okay, how do we solve that? And then by the time you're done, it's again, less about trying to replicate something, which you can, of course, But it's much more about saying, okay, so what about that stuff do I like? What about that stuff would I change in a perfect scenario? And then you just keep refining it. So my main, that's sort of my lead sound. The echoes that I use on it, of course it's a lot of echo, but my creative process, the way that I write is typically just with a guitar, and I use the echoes to sort of interact with the past. So if you're playing a chord, because it sustains so long, I can hear how that note interacts with the C, or that interacts with the C, right? So there's a practical reason for it, other than it just sounding kind of glorious, right? So let's get on to talking about the second patch that I use. And this one is the predominant patch that I use for the set. So it's a cab IR that I had made that is also available on that Gift to Tone preset that we had done. It's a Herbert amp, or not Herbert, Herbie amp. And then the other channel is, what is the other channel? It's, 1959 SLP Jumped, which I use for both a clean and grit sound. One thing that as you're building presets, I've had the fortune of learning just by playing as much as I have and working with as many sound people as I have, is they encourage you to use one cab IR. It seems counterintuitive. You've got thousands of cabs that you can choose from, and you think, okay, I want to have a clean sound that's got an open back 212 with, vintage 30s in it. And for my heavy sound, I want to have like a closed 4x12 Mesa, 75 watt speakers or what have you. And individually it sounds great, but the bigger the venues get, the more those differences in tone are challenging for the front of house guys. So what I did was I got a couple of amplifiers or a couple of cabinets, mic'd them up, put them through all the outboard gear that I wanted, and I shot my own IR that basically functions as, when I was a kid, all I wanted to do was ride dirt bikes. That was my whole thing, man. And there's a type of dirt bike that's not quite a dirt bike and not quite a street bike. It's called an enduro, and the Honda XL. So my cab is essentially that. It's not focused entirely on being a heavy sound. It's not focused entirely on being a clean sound, but it works for both, and it really helps the front of house guy. With the wah. So it's the same wah block, but you can transfer it throughout that. And that's another thing. I think keeping all these blocks that you create stored in your library to recall in each one. It seems, when you're in your bedroom, it seems like the distinctions are slight between the tonalities, but live, it'll save you so much in the long run to keep those things consistent. Also, I've made a replica of this GP100 sound that I had done with for years on Ocean Machine, Infinity, Synkestra. All those albums, I had this really echoey sound that I had relied on to give this sort of sense of space. And it's interesting because there's a high pass filter on it that's up to like maybe 200. It's really, there's nothing from low, mid, down. And so it sits on top of the tone. You'll hear the echo in here. It's sort of a fizzy thing. That sort of thing going on in the background. And because of where it sits in the frequency range, and you do a low pass on the top to get rid of the real cymbal mixers, the stuff that gets in the way of the cymbals and the synths. And it just gives sort of a sense of grandeur to a heavy sound for me. But I've been using this unit for 12 years now, and the fascination for it is endless for me, because I really feel that being able to control the specifics of things like, like the tails on the reverb and the volume between your grit and your clean and your heavy, it's more elegant. And that's really important. Again, the bigger the venues get, the louder the PAs get, the more things like a 2 dB change between your grit sound and your heavy sound, and a cab change that's got like a more significant low end that may not sound like much when you're using a reference amp. You put it through a PA that's the size of a house, and I'll tell you what, that low end is all of a sudden a problem. So refining those things adds a sense of elegance to the show that I think is, for me, like indispensable. I love doing that. The guitar plays a very practical function in the music as it's a component to an orchestral mindset. Not orchestral in the sense of it's orchestra music, but orchestral in that there's a lot of components and they all need to find a spot. Since I was very young, the thing that I personally felt like I wanted to do with progressive music or heavy music was, as much as I wanted to use all those orchestral or spatial or choral elements in my work, I really like meat and potatoes at the bottom. I really like, like the Metallica, Motorhead, Judas Priest, like big riffs. And so a lot of the guitar parts are, affectionately, I would refer to them as knuckle dragging riffs. A lot of my contemporaries, when they play, there's a lot of notes and there's a lot of really interesting chords and a lot of movement. But so much of my music is me just going. Like, that's so much what I do. Big octaves and fifths. My guitars are all, no matter what it is, they're tuned to an open tuning, and 95% of the time it's open C. So that's C, G, C, G, C, E. So it's just a big major chord. And by having just fifths and octaves in your foundation, you can apply the tonality of whatever is going on over top. Say you wanted to do a minor or a major or whatever this one is. I don't know what the name is, but if you want to do that, the foundation, if it's fifths and octaves, you can add that over top and it won't compromise it. But you hear, if I play a minor chord here, it's like the harmonic content of it is unstable, just fundamentally. But if I just did this, and then put this note with the choirs and orchestra, then you get this solidity in the low end that's just super brutal, in my opinion. Essentially, with fifths and octaves, you can fit any of those other intervals into it, and it's going to work. Allows you to have like a crushing simplicity to the basis of the music, which for me is just, that's what I'm about, man. I love having all your arpeggiations and all your orchestral elements and choirs, and we're working with these amazing orchestras and have them do all the complicated stuff. But the basis of it is like, Motorhead or Metallica or simple riffs. And so that's why this preset is the way it is. And so when you come to something like Kingdom, the whole riff is basically. It's just, and then the riff is. But it's just. And everything else can do the, even though, of course, every now and then we've got grace notes. Or in Deadhead, we may have like, but for the most part, like a song like Truth, for example, it's just octaves. It's like, right? The end is just, like a. Simple stuff, right? And when it does come to chordal aspects of it, usually I'll try to make the guitars speak in a way that's more consonant. And by that I mean, unless it's for a specific effect when you're going, which is, you know, dissonant, you get a bunch of guitars and bass doing that, and as an effect it's cool. But if I'm going to do chords, I'll usually try and keep the harmonic content really consonant. That's the only way I can describe it, where the frequencies line up. So that's another part of truth. It's like they're sort of intervals of a major chord, but they still, like vibrationally, it feels to me like the floor moves like this as opposed to like this, right? So it's like, and because I'm in open C, so much of the work has like pedal tones. It's like everything just kind of rings. And when I first started using this tuning, it was after listening to Led Zeppelin when I was a kid and finding that he was in open C. And typically when you play a power chord in standard tuning, it sounds like a power chord. But when you do that same shape in open C, starting on the second string, you get a suspended, which also does that thing with the frequencies. It feels really like vibrationally consonant. So much of the work that I've done is that chord too. So like Storm from Celebrated Evolution is just, really simple stuff, but I love the feeling of like it's a substantial thing. I love big, thick, that leads something, rhythmic components. I like the beat to be relaxed, because when the beat is rushed, it implies a sense of like nervousness, that if you're trying to make something powerful and it rushes, it sounds ridiculous to me. It doesn't work at all. And it's almost like the drums are behind the beat, the bass is behind the drums, the guitar is behind the bass, or, you know, or maybe the other way around, guitar is behind the drums, bass is behind the guitar. But the idea is it should all feel relaxed. And so when you've got a big riff, it just sounds like super heavy, like something like the song Om from years ago, which is just major chords. And so on the foundation, it's just open 2, open 2, open 3, open 1. But the orchestras are doing a full major D chord, like 3 octaves wide. And the choirs are doing like a pulse on a D chord and then a D sharp, and you know what I mean? But the foundation is just, and then everything else is going. But if you just have the foundation, the band, just like octaves and fifths, like. So it should sound like it's taking huge amounts of effort for things to move. You know, it's not, it's like it's so big that even at max capacity of the thing that's towing it, it's still behind the beat. Like that's the intent. out of context, but even as I was playing that, one thing that I think it's important to point out about the construction of where the beat lands with this stuff is it's like I'm listening for that one downbeat in that little arpeggio. It goes daddy 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 daddy. But it's like when that snare hits is where you should land. So everything should be. So it's almost like it's constipated, and then it hits that thing. It's like daddy 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 daddy. You know what I mean? So it's not that it's consciously behind, but it's like, again, it's so. The idea is it's supposed to feel so heavy that even when you're pulling as hard as you can, you're still slow. Like that's the whole idea with all the riffs. It's like, it's just, you know. Thank you so much for paying attention. It's my pleasure to work with Fractal for all these years. I use a lot of equipment, and the reason I use it is because I use it because I love it. And so this is another example of it. This unit has been, it's been a quantum shift in my ability to create because it houses all the options that have prior to that been frustrating in one place. There's no competition for me between amps and digital. It's nothing about that. It's a preference. And for me, this is my preference because it's what works for my music. So I encourage you to find what works for your music, because the whole idea is trying to communicate. So it's less about what you're trying to do or about what you use, and more about getting to your objective. So thanks for paying attention. Thanks, Fractal. This is Devin Townsend. We'll see you soon. Then I'll just make it per song that change. Maybe one has a chorus, maybe one has a talk box or whatever.
Sorry,
He exploded. It's amazing. No, it's great.
I was dying.
That's great.
At the end of the line.
No problem.
So
That's great. Cooper blew up.
I was over here like, oh my God, here it comes. Like,
That's great. But you timed it great, man. Your time is good. You're definitely a musician, man.